Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Playbook's Daily Briefing. This is Playbook's managing editor and author, Jack Blanchard, and it is Thursday, April the 24th, and isn't the year zooming by? I am here again, happily, with Politico's White House bureau chief, Dasha Burns, to talk about everything that's driving the day. Good morning.
What
How are
day
you,
is it?
Dasha? It's
What day is it? What
Thursday.
month is it?
So what listeners need to know is that Dasha was out last night. Where did you go? Did you have a good time?
This is our Super Bowl week, man. We gotta have the stamina. You know, this is the one thing I am jealous of the president of the United States, of the man. The man can party. The man can stay out. The man can talk. He has more energy than I do. I gotta say, I think he's more suited for White House Correspondents' Week than I am.
I always think the hardest thing is remembering the stories you got told at 3 o'clock in the morning. You're like, that's an amazing story. Please remember this. Please remember
That's
this.
the
Do
trouble.
you?
Like, do I take notes? Like, how do I?
It
Because
doesn't
I'm
always
gonna
go
want
down that
this.
well at a cocktail party if you start scribbling in a notepad halfway through the conversation. I promised listeners we would tell them what was driving the day. It's definitely not us going drinking. What is driving the day is actually something much more serious than that. And it
We'll
is
come back with great stories for you, though.
we'll come back with great stories. Thursday is all about Ukraine for me, because in town in Washington today, we have several very senior, important European politicians who are basically coming to talk to Trump and his people about where we're up to in Ukraine and how this thing is now playing out. Trump himself is meeting the Norwegian Prime Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, in the Oval Office, and we'll see once again one of those special moments, Dasha, that we've got used to, where he lines them up in the Oval Office. Reporters are in there shouting questions at both of them. There'll probably be a load of other Trump world characters in there too,
That's
right?
right.
And all of that setup. What's interesting about this, a couple of things. One is that Norway is in itself a really important country when it comes to
Yes.
European security because of particularly its location. The Arctic is becoming an area where everybody is spending a lot of time with their troops or their forces, thinking about that's where a conflict could happen if things get worse in terms of Russian and Western relations. So he's important in his own right, but also he's being joined by the former head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, who used to be the head of NATO and is a Norwegian and a close ally of his, but also knows Donald Trump very well and has spent a lot of time talking with Donald Trump about Ukraine over the past few years. And I think they will both be coming to press the case that the deal we've seen from Donald Trump that he's proposing is kind of essentially it's too good towards Russia and it's not good enough towards Ukraine. And they're not the only ones coming to say that. The new head of NATO, Mark Rutte, who's taken over from Stoltenberg, is also in DC. And he is meeting up with Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, Marco Rubio, the secretary of state, Mike Waltz, the national security advisor. And I'm sure this is almost like a pincer movement from Europe, or at least that's what they're trying to do, right? To try and
It's
talk.
it's it's so many forces colliding here, and different ideologies too, and positions on foreign policy from the conservative perspective on the Trump team as well. You have Marco Rubio on one side, you have Steve Witkoff, who's been heavily involved in all of this, that comes from a slightly different worldview here. So how that all plays out when they're all sitting there in that room with all of the press and with all of these different leaders, you know, who does Trump call on? You remember famously that moment where he gave it to JD Vance, the vice president, with the Zelenskyy meeting, and things kind of went off the rails from there. So all of those movements that, you know, in a traditional administration might be somewhat choreographed, here you just don't know. It's going to be improvised. It's going to be Trump's instincts in that moment. And how these leaders approach Trump with, you said they're going to press him, right, on what he's trying to do with Russia, Ukraine, how they press him. I mean, that's going to be key, because we've seen that go awry if they press him too much.
Completely. We saw Zelenskyy gave a very good demonstration of how not to do it in the Oval Office a couple of months ago. Jens Stoltenberg is an old hand at this. You know, he spent many years dealing with Donald Trump. He's seen as a bit of a Trump whisperer in NATO world. So maybe he
That's
knows
what's
how.
necessary right now.
Yeah, knows how to have these conversations. I think from Donald Trump's point of view, you know, he's put forward this peace plan, which we haven't actually seen, to be clear, but it's certainly been pretty well briefed to various outlets. And essentially his idea is that we freeze things where they are. Russia gets to keep 20% of Ukraine. Ukraine just has to suck that up. Ukraine is not allowed to join NATO. Basically, Putin gets quite a lot of his demands as a reward for having invaded his neighboring country. And Donald Trump gets to say that he has solved the problem and created peace. There's not a lot there for Ukraine in European eyes. And that is why there's so much upset and unrest about it. And it doesn't look to me like Ukraine are anywhere near accepting this. So the question is, what happens then, right? Like, how
Right.
does Donald Trump take that if Zelenskyy just says no deal?
Well, and President Trump is growing increasingly impatient, and his team, his cabinet, and the vice president are echoing that impatience on his behalf. Look, let's remember President Trump's very first interaction with Zelenskyy was the perfect phone call back in 2019.
Just remind our listeners what that was.
That was the phone call in which he essentially pressed Zelenskyy to find dirt on his then political opponent, Joe Biden, who was running in the as in the Democratic primary, and that was the beginning. And I don't think we can forget that, because that is ultimately what led Democrats to impeach President Trump. And he doesn't get over things like that, and that's tied in with Zelenskyy. And even though Zelenskyy at the time said, he didn't feel like he was being blackmailed, he actually, was very quite gracious with President Trump. That taste is still in his mouth, and Ukraine has been a thorn in his side politically, basically from then on. And so, with someone like Trump, those things do have an impact. And it's what 5-6 years later, and now this is one of the biggest world conflicts as he is president. He said that he was going to solve this in 24 hours, maybe before he even took office, and now we're almost at 100 days and it has not yet been solved. And so I think there's a sort of a time pressure of either I get this done or I say, you know what, these guys aren't here to play ball, and brush his hands clean of that. I think that for those of us that have been following Trump, this deal that he's hoping to strike is not surprising. We have heard that he would likely want to just freeze things where they are, give a bunch of Ukraine to Putin and say, shake hands and walk away. That doesn't mean it is not extraordinary, and for Europe, shocking and frankly scary because of what it might mean and where Putin might go from here. But for the Trump administration, and especially how J.D. Vance and some of the others in his orbit feel about Ukraine and not wanting to be entangled in that, it's not surprising from a Trump worldview.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I do wonder, we hear Steve Witkoff, Trump's sort of omnipresent envoy, who basically does all of his important foreign missions for him, is off to Moscow again this week. We think on Friday for more talks with Putin, and we'll presumably want to discuss in detail there this peace plan, if you can call it that the president is pushing. That
It's
meeting
also
could end
important
up
to
being
think about, by the way, who is going overseas and having those meetings. It's not Marco Rubio, the sort of traditional Republican foreign policy voice. It's Steve Witkoff, a close friend of President Trump's, who he's just delegated all of the stuff that would normally be left to a Secretary of State to do.
So interesting that, and you get the sense he probably doesn't really trust Rubio to do it on his own. Rubio, of course, was in a previous life, a different version of Marco Rubio, was like one of the staunchest defenders of Ukraine in Congress, putting forward legislation that this sort of recognition of Crimea, for example, would never happen. Suddenly he's transformed into this new guy, but
things we should
really
not forget,
like
the seasons of Trump, perfect phone call, and Marco Rubio 1.0.
Right, exactly. But I do wonder that Witkoff Putin meeting, if it is on Friday, potentially more important than anything that's happening today, because if those two are able to cut a deal and America and Russia turn around and say, okay, we've got a plan, take it or leave it, Ukraine, then we're in a quite a seriously fast-moving situation into next week. And what's amazing, Dasha, is as I said at the start, a lot of these people are all getting together in Rome on Saturday for the funeral of the Pope. Like, talk about this. Like, if you're writing a movie, then they're going to be having these side meetings while this incredible, momentous thing is happening in Rome, and the drama of it all is extraordinary.
It's a weekend of extraordinary get-togethers.
Yes, not least our own with the White House Correspondents' Dinner somehow feels less significant. But anyway, I think we'd better leave it there. Dasha, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure you stay hydrated over the next few days and enjoy the weekend. You can find more of this conversation by listening to Playbook's Daily Briefing wherever you get your podcast. For more of our thoughts on this and anything else you need to know, please read Playbook this morning, every morning at politico.com/playbook. I'm Jack Blanchard. That was Dasha. Thanks, Dasha.
Electrolytes. Have a good one.
Electrolytes, top tip. Thanks for listening.